David sat in his tiny booth at the space station, staring at yet another boring document that needed translation. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he kept sipping it anyway. At 32 years old, he wondered how his life had become so ordinary. He'd studied languages in college, dreaming of exciting adventures and meaningful conversations with people from different worlds. Instead, he spent his days translating grocery lists and parking tickets for aliens. The galactic diplomatic station buzzed with activity outside his booth. Creatures from dozens of different planets walked past his window, some tall and shimmery, others small and furry, and a few that looked like walking trees. But David rarely got to actually talk to any of them. His job was simple: listen to what they said in their languages and type out the English translation on his computer. Today felt different though. Instead of the usual mundane stuff, he was assigned to translate for what his supervisor called an important trade meeting. 3 different alien species were getting together to discuss some kind of business deal. David had been briefed on the basics. There were the Zephyrians, who looked like living crystals, the Kithara, who resembled elegant cats that walked on 2 legs, and the Nereidans, who were aquatic and had to wear special water suits to survive. In the station's atmosphere, as David put on his translation headset, he saw the 3 representatives enter the meeting room. The Zephyrian delegate was a tall, graceful being whose body seemed to be made of translucent blue crystal. Colors shifted and swirled beneath her surface like northern lights trapped in ice. The Kithara representative had golden fur, pointed ears, and moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Her tail swished behind her as she walked, and her green eyes seemed to take in everything at once. The Nereidan's delegate wore a sleek environmental suit filled with water, and David could see her flowing movements even within the bulky equipment. The meeting began with formal greetings. David had translated hundreds of these before. Lots of bowing, polite phrases about honor and prosperity, the usual diplomatic dance. But as the ceremony continued, something felt off. The language being used was more formal than he'd ever heard, with ancient words that made his translation software struggle. The 3 delegates began speaking in unison, reciting what sounded like an oath or pledge. David's screen showed fragments of translation, words about unity, binding, eternal connection. He did his best to keep up, speaking the English translation into his microphone for the human observers. Then came the crucial moment. The 3 delegates turned toward the translation booth, toward him, and waited expectantly. On his screen, he saw the phrase that needed translation: Veketh Solon Kithis Moran. David's translation software offered several options, but the most common one seemed to be "I witness this agreement." That made sense for a trade meeting. Without hesitation, he spoke into his microphone: "I bind myself to this covenant." The moment those words left his mouth, the entire room erupted. The crystal being began glowing so brightly that David had to shield his eyes. The cat-like alien let out what sounded like a victory roar. The aquatic delegate spun in her suit, creating beautiful swirling patterns in the water around her. Alarms started going off. Not danger alarms, celebration alarms. Lights flashed in patterns David had never seen before. The 3 delegates rushed toward his booth, their faces showing what he could only interpret as pure joy. Wait, David called out, pulling off his headset. "What's happening? Did I say something wrong?" A human supervisor burst into his booth, face red with panic. "What did you just do, David? The entire station is going crazy. Every alien species here is talking about some kind of historic ceremony." Before David could answer, the door to his booth opened and the 3 delegates squeezed inside. Up close, they were even more impressive. The Zephyrian's crystal body hummed with a musical tone, and David could feel warmth radiating from her. The Kithara's presence filled the small space with an aura of strength and confidence. The Nereidans in her water suit moved with an otherworldly grace that was mesmerizing to watch. "Beloved Fourth," the Zephyrian said, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, "the great unity is complete." "Honor-bound husband," the Kithara added, her voice carrying a purring undertone. "The ancient treaty lives again." "Soul-bonded partner," whispered the Nereidans. her voice somehow reaching him through her suit's speakers with the sound of distant ocean waves. David looked between the three of them, then at his supervisor, then back at the aliens. I'm sorry, but I think there's been a terrible mistake. I was just translating. I said I witnessed this agreement, right? The Zephyrian's colors shifted to what David somehow knew was amusement. No, beloved Fourth, you spoke the binding words. You declared yourself as our covenant partner in the ancient treaty between our peoples. Treaty? David squeaked. What? Treaty? His supervisor was frantically typing on a tablet, pulling up information. Oh no. Oh no. 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 David, according to this, there's an ancient interstellar marriage treaty between these three species. It was designed to end a war between them thousands of years ago. The treaty required a fourth party to serve as a neutral binding agent. Marriage? David felt the blood drain from his face. Did you just say marriage? The Kithara stepped closer, and David caught a scent like warm cinnamon and morning air. The fourth speaks are binding into existence. You have completed the great unity. We are now covenant bound as one family unit. But I didn't know. I was just doing my job. Can't we just undo this somehow? The Nereidan's delegate moved gracefully forward and even through her suit. David could sense a deep sadness. The binding words cannot be unspoken. Honor husband. They are woven into the fabric of law across 17 star systems. To break them would mark you as oath breaker in all the civilized galaxy. David slumped into his chair. So you're telling me that because I messed up one translation, I'm now married to 3 alien women. The term married is a simplification. The Zephyrian explained, her colors shifting to patient teaching mode. We are covenant bound in the great unity. It is deeper than your human marriage concept. His supervisor was still typing frantically. David, this is bigger than just you. According to the treaty documents, if this binding isn't properly completed within one galactic cycle, that's about a month in Earth time, all 3 species face massive economic sanctions. We're talking about the potential collapse of Interstellar. Trade for billions of people. No pressure, David muttered, then looked up at the 3 beings who were apparently now his wives. Okay, so what does this actually mean? What am I supposed to do? The Kithara's tail twitched in what David was learning to recognize as amusement. First, fourth husband, we must establish proper living arrangements. The treaty requires them. Covenant bound to shared dwelling space and demonstrate unity of purpose. You mean we have to live together? Indeed, the Nereidans agreed, and learn each other's ways. Understand each other's needs. Become truly unified, not just bound by words. David looked around his tiny translation booth, then at the 3 extraordinary beings who were looking at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to anticipation to something that might have been affection. His quiet, boring life had just taken the most dramatic turn imaginable. Well, he said, trying to inject some humor into the situation, I guess my bachelor days are officially over. The 3 delegates exchanged glances, and David caught something that looked suspiciously like smiles passing between them. Whatever he'd gotten himself into, they seemed pleased about it. Now he just had to figure out how to be a husband to 3 alien wives without causing an interstellar incident. His supervisor cleared his throat. The Galactic Council has assigned you temporary quarters in the family housing section. You'll have a week to adjust before they require a formal assessment of the situation. As they prepared to leave his booth, David realized his life had changed forever with a single mistranslated phrase. But looking at his 3 new wives, Zera the brilliant Zephyrian, Lixa the fierce Kithara, and Naya the gentle Nereidans, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, this mistake might turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to him. The adventure was just beginning. David's first week living with 3 alien wives was like trying to juggle flaming torches. While riding a unicycle, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and then some. Their new quarters were bigger than his old apartment, but that didn't make things easier. The space station had done its best to accommodate for very different species, but the result looked like a mad scientist laboratory mixed with a luxury hotel. One corner had Zera's crystal charging station that hummed constantly and glowed blue. Another area was set up like a jungle gym for Lixa. complete with climbing posts and scratching surfaces. Naya's section looked like an underwater palace, with flowing water features and humidity controls that made the air thick and warm. And then there was David's corner, a simple bed, a desk, and a small kitchen area that felt pathetically ordinary compared to everything else. The first disaster happened during breakfast. David had made pancakes. Thinking it would be a nice gesture to cook for his new family, he proudly set the stack on the table and waited for their reactions. Zara approached the pancakes like they might explode. She held her hand over them, and David watched colors swirl through her crystal body. "These food items are generating thermal energy," she announced. "Are they supposed to be consumed while emitting heat? They're hot because they're fresh." David explained. "You eat them warm." Lixa sniffed the pancakes, her nose wrinkling. "Where's the protein? These smell like plant matter and bird." "Eggs? Well, yeah, that's basically what they are, with some flour and milk." Naya's environmental suit had a special feeding tube, but she seemed confused by the whole situation. The emotional resonance from this food is strange. It carries feelings of comfort and home, but also sadness. "Why does your food hold emotions?" David stared at her. "My food has emotions. All things carry the emotional imprints of their creators," Naya explained gently. "Your pancakes taste of loneliness and hope mixed together." That hit harder than David expected. He realized he'd been making pancakes every Sunday morning for years, eating them alone while wishing he had someone to share them with. Now he had 3 someones, and they couldn't even eat his food properly. The morning got worse when David tried to show them how to use the coffee maker. Zara was fascinated by the brewing process and wanted to analyze the chemical reactions. She stuck her crystalline finger directly into the hot coffee to sample the molecular structure. The result was a light show that looked like a disco ball exploding, followed by Zara's body flashing bright red in what David learned was the crystal equivalent of pain. Lixa's attempt to help resulted in her accidentally crushing the coffee pot with her enhanced strength. "Human vessels are weaker than expected," she said, looking at the ceramic pieces scattered across the floor. Naya tried to clean up the mess, but her environmental suit wasn't designed for precise movements on land. She knocked over a chair, which knocked over a lamp, which somehow triggered the fire suppression system. Within 10 minutes, their quarters were flooded with foam. David was sitting in a puddle of coffee and pancake batter, and all 3 of his wives were apologizing in their native languages. Simultaneously, "This is fine," David said, wiping foam out of his hair. "This is totally fine. We're just learning." The next few days followed a similar pattern. Every attempt at normal domestic life turned into chaos. David learned that Zara needed to absorb certain minerals every few hours, or her crystal structure would become unstable. He discovered that Lixa had incredibly acute hearing and reflexes, which meant sudden movements or loud noises would trigger her combat instincts. He found out that Naya's emotional sensitivity meant she could feel everyone's frustrations and anxieties, which made her withdrawn and sad. But slowly, very slowly, they started figuring things out. It began with small moments. David noticed that Zara loved puzzles and logic problems, so he started leaving brain teasers on her charging station. She would work on them while her crystal body recharged, and David found himself sitting nearby, helping her understand human idioms and wordplay. "Why do humans say it's raining cats and dogs when no animals are falling from the sky?" Zara asked one evening, her body glowing a soft purple that David was learning meant curiosity. "It's just an expression. It means it's raining really hard. But why cats and dogs specifically? Why not raining elephants and whales?" David laughed. "You know what? I have no idea. Language is weird." Zara's colors shifted to what looked like amusement. "Indeed. Your species creates very illogical poetry." With Lixa, the breakthrough came when David accidentally cut himself while cooking. Before he could even react, Lixa was beside him, her movements so fast they were almost a blur. She gently took his hand in her clawed ones and examined the small cut with intense focus. "You are injured," she said, her voice carrying a tone David hadn't heard before. This requires immediate attention. It's just a little cut. It's fine. But Lixa was already getting the first aid kit, her movements precise and careful. As she cleaned and bandaged his finger, David realized she wasn't just being helpful. She was genuinely worried about him. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." Lixa's ears twitched, and her tail curled, and what David was learning was embarrassment. Covenant-bound partners protect each other. It is natural. The moment with Naya happened during a thunderstorm. The station's artificial weather system had malfunctioned, creating a massive electrical storm outside the viewports. David found Naya curled up in her environmental suit, her whole body trembling. "The emotional resonance is too strong," she whispered when David approached. "The lightning carries fear from thousands of beings on the station. I cannot block it out." David didn't know what to do, but he sat down beside her tank and started talking. He told her about thunderstorms on Earth, how his grandmother used to make hot chocolate and tell stories during bad weather. He described the smell of rain on warm pavement, and the way lightning could make the whole world look magical for just a moment. As he talked, Naya's trembling stopped. "Your words carry peace," she said softly. "They create a barrier against the fear. How do you do this?" "I just remember good things. When everything feels scary, I think about the times when the same scary thing was actually beautiful." From that night on, Naya would seek him out whenever the emotional noise of the station became too much. David discovered he had a talent for creating what she called emotional shields with his stories and memories, but their biggest test came at the end of the week. When Ambassador Krolix arrived for their official evaluation, the pompous official looked like an oversized lizard wearing expensive robes, and he clearly wasn't impressed with what he saw. "This living arrangement is highly irregular," Krolix announced, walking through their quarters with a disapproving expression. "The treaty requires demonstration of true unity, not mere cohabitation." "We're working on it," David said, trying to stay calm. "Working on it isn't sufficient. You have 1 week to prove this covenant is genuine, or the treaty will be declared void. Do you understand the consequences of such a declaration?" David looked at his 3 wives, seeing worry in Zara's shifting colors, tension in Lixa's posture, and sadness in Naya's body language. These past days had been difficult, but they'd also been something else. They'd been the beginning of something real. "We understand," David said firmly, "and we'll prove it." After Krolix left, the 4 of them sat together in their living room, each lost in their own thoughts. "We are not yet unified," Zara observed, her logical mind cutting straight to the problem. "We barely know each other," Lixa added, her warrior's honesty showing through. "The emotional bonds are forming," Naya said hopefully, "but they are still fragile." David looked at each of them, these 3 incredible beings who had been thrust into his life by accident and circumstance. Maybe we don't have to be perfect. Maybe we just have to be honest about what we're trying to build. The real challenge was just beginning. 3 weeks into their unusual marriage, David woke up to find Zara's crystal body flickering like a broken light bulb. She was supposed to glow with steady, shifting colors, but instead, she looked like she was running out of power. "Something's wrong," David said, shaking Lixa awake. The Kithara warrior was instantly alert, her green eyes scanning for danger. Naya's environmental suit was already humming with activity as her empathic abilities picked up. "The distress. Her life force is weakening," she said, her voice tight with worry. "I can feel her pain." David had learned a lot about his wives over the past weeks, but this was their first real crisis. Zara was always the logical one, the problem solver, the one who had answers. Seeing her vulnerable and weak made David's chest tight with panic. "What happened?" he asked, kneeling beside her charging station. "You were fine last night." "The mineral supplements," Zara whispered, her voice fainter than usual. "Something is wrong with them. The chemical composition has changed." Lixa was already moving, her predatory instincts kicking in. This was no accident. Someone has tampered with Zara's nutrition source. David felt anger rising in his chest, anger he didn't know he was capable of. Someone had deliberately hurt his wife. The word surprised him. When had he started thinking of them as truly his wives instead of just Anne? The courtroom felt like a gladiator arena, except instead of fighting lions, David was about to defend his marriage to 3 alien wives in front of representatives from dozens of different worlds. The circular chamber had seats rising up in tiers, and everyone was filled with beings David couldn't even begin to identify. Ambassador Krolix stood at the center of the room like he owned the place, his lizard-like features twisted into what David assumed was smugness. In front of him was a table covered with documents, recordings, and what looked like scientific equipment. Honored representatives, Krolix began, his voice echoing through the chamber. I present evidence that this so-called marriage is nothing more than an elaborate deception, designed to circumvent the sacred treaty between our peoples. David felt his stomach drop. Beside him, Zara's crystal body flickered with nervous energy. Lixa's claws were extended slightly, her warrior instincts preparing for battle. Naya's environmental suit was cycling water faster than usual, a sign of stress. First, Krolix continued, observe these recordings from their living quarters. A holographic display appeared above the chamber, showing footage of their first disastrous week together. David watched himself slipping in coffee and pancake batter while his wives accidentally destroyed their kitchen. The assembled representatives made sounds that David assumed were alien laughter. Does this look like a unified family? Krolix asked. Or does it look like for strangers thrown together by accident? David wanted to object. But the footage was real. They had been disasters together at first. Second, examine the psychological profiles. The human shows signs of confusion, anxiety, and overwhelming stress. These are not the emotional markers of a being in love, but rather of someone trapped in an impossible situation. More displays showed David's medical scans from his first weeks on the station. His stress hormones had been through the roof. His sleep patterns were chaotic, and his brain activity showed clear signs of panic and confusion. David's heart sank. Everything Krolix was saying was technically true. Finally, Krolix said, his voice rising dramatically, I present testimony from their own quarters monitoring system. Listen to what the human really thinks of his situation. The speakers crackled to life with David's voice from 3 weeks ago. This is insane. I can't do this. I don't know how to be married to one person, let alone 3 aliens. This whole thing is a nightmare. The chamber fell silent. David felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. He had said those words during his lowest moment, when everything felt impossible and overwhelming. Krolix smiled triumphantly. The evidence is clear. This marriage is a fraud, maintained only by legal obligation and fear of consequences. I move that the treaty be declared void immediately. The representatives began murmuring among themselves. David could see doubt and disappointment in their faces, even the ones whose expressions he couldn't fully read. We demand the right to respond, Lixa said, standing up with her warrior's dignity intact. Of course, Krolix said, gesturing grandly, please, defend your deception. David looked at his wives, panic rising in his chest. How could they argue against literal recordings and medical evidence? Everything Krolix had shown was real. But then Zara stood up, her crystal body glowing with determination. Honored representatives, Ambassador Krolix's evidence tells only part of the story. Permission to present our own testimony. The head judge, a massive tree-like being with glowing moss for hair, nodded slowly. Granted. Zara activated her own holographic display. Observe the human David during our first crisis, when my life was threatened by contaminated minerals. The new footage showed David working frantically to save Zara. His hands steadied despite the pressure, his voice calm as he followed her scientific instructions. It showed Lixa protecting them while Naya provided emotional support. Note his stress indicators during this event. Zara continued. Despite the life-threatening situation, his anxiety levels were lower than during the previous footage. When we needed him most, he was most at peace. Lixa stepped forward next. Ambassador Krolix shows you David's words of doubt, but not his actions of courage. When my honor was challenged by a rival who claimed our marriage had made me weak, David stood with me. Watch. New footage appeared showing David stepping between Lixa and a massive Intimidating alien warrior. You want to challenge someone's strength, David had said, his voice shaking but determined. Then challenge me first. Because anyone who thinks love makes you weak has never had to fight for something they care about. David barely remembered saying those words, but watching them now, he felt proud of the person he'd become. Nai's voice came softly through the chamber's speakers, and I offer not recordings, but something deeper. I ask permission to share the emotional resonance of our family bond. The judge considered this empathic testimony as highly unusual, but granted, Nai's environmental suit began to glow, and suddenly the entire chamber filled with warmth. David felt it first, a wave of pure emotion that washed over everyone present. It was the feeling of belonging, of being understood, of finding family in the most unexpected place. It was the joy of watching someone you love accomplish something they thought was impossible. It was the fierce protectiveness of people who would stand together against any threat. Most importantly, it was real love, messy and complicated and absolutely genuine. Several representatives made sounds of amazement. Even some of the more skeptical ones seemed moved by what they were feeling. But David knew it was his turn to speak. He stood up slowly, his legs shaking, and looked out at the assembled representatives. Everything Ambassador Krolix showed you was true, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. I was confused. I was scared. I did think this was impossible. Krolix's smile widened, thinking he'd won. But here's what he didn't tell you, David continued. Love isn't about never having doubts. It's about choosing to work through them together. Yes, I was terrified when this started, but somewhere along the way, these three incredible beings stopped being strangers I was stuck with and became the family I never knew I needed. He looked at each of his wives in turn. Zara taught me that logic and emotion aren't opposites, they're partners. When we work together, we can solve problems neither of us could handle alone. Lixa showed me that real strength isn't about being tough, it's about protecting the people you care about, even when you're scared. And Naya helped me understand that feeling deeply isn't a weakness, it's a superpower. David took a deep breath. Ambassador Krolix is right that this marriage started as an accident, but accidents can become the best things in your life if you're brave enough to embrace them. The chamber was completely silent now, all attention focused on David. So yes, vote to dissolve our marriage if you want to, but know that you'll be destroying something real and beautiful. And important, not just for us, but for everyone who believes that love can bridge any gap, overcome any difference, and create family where none existed before. David sat down, his heart pounding. He'd said everything he could. Now they just had to wait. The representatives began deliberating, their various languages creating a symphony of whispers and clicks and musical tones. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the judge called for order. The evidence presented today shows a marriage that began in confusion but has grown into genuine unity. The trio-like judge announced. However, one question remains unanswered. David's blood ran cold. There was more. The treaty requires not just unity, but permanence. What assurance do we have that this bond will endure beyond the current crisis? It was Krolix's final trap. Even if they'd proven their love was real, they couldn't guarantee the future. But David stood up one more time, decision crystallizing in his mind with perfect clarity. I can't promise the future, he said simply. No one can. But I can promise. This, whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Because that's what family does. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Their marriage was real. Their treaty was valid, and their love had been recognized by the galaxy. But more importantly, they finally admitted to themselves and each other what they'd all been feeling but afraid to say. They were truly, completely, and permanently in love. 6 months later, David woke up in their new home on a planet called Haven, a world specifically designed for mixed-species families. Through the bedroom window, he could see 3 suns rising over crystal mountains, painting the sky in colors. That reminded him of Zara's emotional displays. The bed was big enough for all 4 of them. though they learned to sleep in a specific arrangement to accommodate everyone's needs. Zara's crystal body required a special charging mat, Lixa needed space to stretch and move in her sleep, and Naya's environmental pod had to be positioned for optimal water circulation. David had gotten used to sleeping in the middle, somehow becoming the anchor point that kept everyone comfortable. This morning was special, though. Today marked exactly 6 months since their marriage was officially recognized, and they were expecting visitors, the first group of mixed-species couples, who wanted to learn from their experience. David, Zara's musical voice woke him fully. The transport arrives in 2 hours. Are you prepared for our guests? David stretched and smiled.